So today we're going to be doing the First Crusade. The Crusades are really interesting. It's one of those things that gives Catholicism a bad rep. It's one of those moments in history where it's like, we're past that. It's one of those things. Nobody's proud of the Crusades at this point. This one should be. I know at least one of them basically did nothing. I don't remember if that was the first one or the third one, because I know the third crusade was also on there. I've taken courses on this, but as you can probably tell at this stage, I didn't do too well. I could have done a better job, is all I'm saying. So this is going to be a bit of a refresher. Maybe there's some things I'll know around this, but I'm a blank slate and I'm prepared to learn. I'm very excited. This should be a lot of fun. Anything that involves the Pope ends up being really interesting because it's such a fascinating position, especially in the Middle Ages. So let's get it started. In France, crusade is not seen as something that bad.
The year is 1095 CE. We stand at the Council of Clermont. In the audience are all the great names of Europe, secular and ecclesiastic. For a moment, there's a hush. The last words of Pope Urban II's fiery speech extolling nations of Christendom to retake the Holy Land from Muslim invaders hangs in the air. Then someone in the crowd shouts, "Deus vult! God wills it!" The chant is picked up by man after man until the council rings with deafening shouts of Deus vult. Then, out of the crowd, a bishop named Ademar rushes up and falls to his knees before the Pope, proclaiming that he will lead any willing Christian to reclaim the Holy Land for Christ. And thus, the First Crusade began. There's just a few problems. You see, by this point, Muslims had actually occupied the Holy Land for nearly 400 years, and there was little evidence of the various atrocities Urban invoked in his speech to incite Europe to crusade. In fact, the Church had never seemed very concerned about the occupation before now, and pilgrimages to the Holy Land had continued practically uninterrupted since Jerusalem fell into Muslim hands in 637. So what was really going on? Well, earlier that year, Alexius Comnenus, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, an empire that had fallen a long way since the days of Justinian, had sent envoys to the Pope.
So the one thing I do know is that the Byzantine Empire, they didn't call themselves the Byzantines. They would have considered themselves an extension of the Roman Empire. However, the Roman Empire, as we know it, has long since fallen. It feels in a lot of ways so separate that we use the Byzantine term in order to differentiate it. So they wouldn't have been like, "I'm the Byzantine emperor" or whatever. It'd be like, "No, I am the Roman emperor. I am the Caesar."
That had fallen a long way since the days of Justinian, had sent envoys to the Pope asking for help from the West against the Seljuk Turks. These Turkish Muslims coming out of the East had practically pushed the empire to its limits, forcing them out of nearly all of Anatolia, the traditional heartland of his empire. Alexius Comnenus had hoped for supplies, arms, and a few thousand well-trained men so that Byzantium could continue to serve as the bulwark of Christian Europe against the Muslim East, or really so he could just win this war, retake his territory, and strengthen the empire he was the head of, but, it's all in how you sell it. Well, Pope Urban had a slightly different idea. You see, the Pope wasn't in the most secure position. The Church was basically at war with the Holy Roman Emperor. Another pope named Clement III had been installed in Ravenna, and claimed to be the rightful pope. In fact, Urban couldn't even enter Rome, hence why he was kicking around in France, because the Holy Roman Emperor and the antipope held it against him. So Urban thought, maybe let's unite all of Christendom to fight somebody else. Of course, he never really asked for Alexius Comnenus' opinion on this plan, but we'll deal with that more later. And thus, the First Crusade began. But Urban was a smart guy. He knew how to motivate people. He knew how to gather a force larger and more cohesive than any nation in Europe could muster. He would offer to those who had spent their life fighting, those who had spent their lives committing mortal sins, one chance, one opportunity for absolution. And he would offer that opportunity for doing the thing they did best, going to war. This is the first time a pope had ever done this. Never before had a plenary indulgence been offered for martial
free. Oh, jeez. Oh, jeez, indeed. Oh, that's kind of hilarious, though. I did know about this. This is why the Protestant Revolution happened, because they kept doing stuff like this. There's indulgences. They just gave out too much there. I don't know. It really does undermine, I guess, the morality and the high standards of religion to have a straight up get out of hell free card. It comes off as very cynically political, and I guess a lot of us can see that now, but at the time, this seems like quite the deal.
Action. And this innovation drew a lot of people. And truth is, though I may have my suspicions about some of the motivations of the leaders of this movement, in a world as motivated by faith as medieval Europe, I think that faith and a hope for absolution...
Hey, Phantom Crusader, you did not miss the First Crusade. We are like 3 minutes into the first episode of that, so you missed H.P. Lovecraft, though. You know, we had a very fun conversation about H.P. Lovecraft, and you'll regret having missed that because it was a blast. You're gonna have to check out the VOD.
Was the reason that so many people bankrupted themselves just so they could join the crusade. But unfortunately, this offer was so good that a lot of people who signed up weren't quite the people the Pope meant to get. You see, the Pope had set a date of August 1096 for the Crusaders to leave from Europe, so that knights and barons could get their affairs in order, and so that they could prepare what in the Middle Ages counted as supply and logistics. But that wasn't fast enough for some people. In France, there was a fellow by the name of Peter the Hermit, who began whipping up the peasantry. He talked of the atrocities he'd witnessed in the Holy Land, although there's a fair amount of evidence to say that he never actually went there. And he told tales of his divine appointment by Christ to lead the spiritually pure who would be protected by heaven to Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of people left their farms to join Peter, although they had no money for the journey and didn't even know how far it was from their homes in Western Europe to the Levant. Few of them were soldiers, and fewer still even owned weapons. But as Peter preached, word of this peasants' crusade began. And while Peter was still gathering his tide of peasants at Cologne, other groups decided that they were just going to set out on their own. And this is where the People's Crusade becomes one of the most unmitigated messes in the history of history. First, there's the group from France under a fellow...
Yeah, this must be the one that I learned a little bit more about. I'm pretty sure this crusade basically ends with very little actually gained from it in the long run. The Crusades are generally not considered huge successes from what I'm aware, in general. Though there were many of them, and I'm sure there's plenty of elements that I don't know. I don't think this is, I'm pretty sure this is the one that's basically a nothing. They fought a whole lot for nothing. From the vibe that I'm getting this early on. I could be wrong, we'll see.
Fellow named Walter Sonnevoire. They left ahead of Peter and made it through Hungary all right, but when they showed up at Belgrade, the doorstep of the Byzantine Empire, the local governor was very confused. He'd been told that the Crusaders weren't supposed to show up for another half a year at least. And weren't they supposed to be soldiers? This was just a mob led by a few impoverished knights. So he didn't let them in. He told them he was going to send a letter back to Constantinople, and could they please just wait patiently until he got his instructions in order? How did they respond? By pillaging the countryside. In all fairness to the Crusaders, they were probably starving. They hadn't thought to bring many supplies with them, and you've got to remember, this is spring in medieval Europe. It's not like they had refrigeration and rapid transport. Man. The bulk of the food for the year comes in during the fall harvest, which is exactly why Urban scheduled his crusade to start in the middle of August, so it could be...
Kuronosa. There were many crusades, some of which almost didn't fail. Yeah, that's about as optimistically as you could probably frame it.
Easy to resupply as they went. But by springtime, there's just not very much food around, so it's unlikely the Crusaders had been able to really stock up on spare provisions on their trek through Hungary. So the Crusaders went on a pillaging spree. They destroyed homes and farms. They even came to blows with the local Byzantine garrison. Some of them even went back to Hungary, which they'd managed to cross through before without doing any harm, and tried to loot a local market. They tried, but the townsfolk kicked them out, and the local Byzantine garrison beat them down too. And soon, cowed, these first Crusaders were brought under escort to Constantinople. We'll catch up with them in a bit when Peter gets there. But first we should talk about the second splinter group of the People's Crusade, a group from Germany led by Count Emicho of Leiningen. This count had heard of Peter's preachings and had gathered his own group to go crusade. They were to head off to the Holy Land from Germany, but, well, they only got a few miles before they seemed to decide that, the local Jews are a lot closer and less well-armed. And so they went from town to town through Germany, sacking their own cities, slaughtering the Jewish population, and stealing any money they might find.
It's not funny. It's one of those things where it's like just so absurd and obviously evil that like it's like, oh, humanity, how dare you have done such a thing. I often find myself when studying history laughing at atrocities all the time, because if you don't, you'll go just mad with how depressing history is. You have to be able to like meme it a little bit. Oh, but that's just terrible.
Unilaterally by the Catholic Church. This wasn't at all what Urban had called for. Even if you argue he didn't care about Jews, there's no question he wanted the fighting out of Christendom at the very least. Not only did priests and monks preach against this sort of violence, but there are actually heroic stories of bishops opposing these marauding crusaders and trying to protect their local Jewish communities. The Bishop of Speyer gave them his protection. The Bishop of Worms brought the local Jews to take refuge in his home and even tried to fortify the place. But the Christian crusaders attacked and stormed the bishop's house, slaughtering some 800 Jews hiding there. The Bishop of Mainz did the same, and even ordered the town barred against the crusaders. In fact, there, the local Jewish population even raised a great deal of gold to give Emicho if he would just go away. But Emicho took the bribe, and then attacked the city anyway. When word of the attack reached him, the bishop raised his personal guard and rushed to join forces with the governor's militia and a force of local burgesses, who had come out armed to defend the local Jewish population. After fierce fighting, the locals drove the crusaders off. But the crusaders gathered more men, recruited some sympathetic or bribable townsfolk, and attacked again. This time, the defenders broke and fled. In the aftermath, thousands of Jews were slaughtered. Emicho's band massacred their way through Germany until at last, they ended up at the Hungarian border. By this time, Peter and his crusade had already passed through Hungary. We'll talk about how their trip went next time. But when the King of Hungary saw Emicho's marauding band, he decided that, nope, he was having none of this, and refused to let them into his country. The Crusaders decided to force their way in anyway, and promptly laid siege to the Hungarian Christian city of Moson, where they were promptly defeated by the city garrison and slaughtered almost to a man.
This crusade
and thus,
is dumb.
The First Crusade began. Join us next time to find out what happens to Peter's band of itinerant peasants, find out what the Pope and the nobles were doing all this time, and watch the First Crusade begin in earnest.
Okay. Yeah, this doesn't feel like the First Crusade has really kicked off right, like proper. This is just a mishmash of a bunch of people just throwing themselves in random directions in the name of holiness, when in reality they seem to lack any general direction. Only the Pope put somebody in charge of this. He didn't really seem to have a plan on that. You doing all right over there?
Bird.
Watching the bird.
He's
Yeah,
so
he's doing well. All right, we're gonna go into part 2 now. Peter the Hermit. Okay, here we go.
Last we left off, Count Emicho's disastrous crusade had been smashed in Hungary, and the French contingent of peasant crusaders had been escorted under guard to Constantinople. Now it's time we return to Peter and his main force of peasant crusaders in Cologne. By the time Peter was ready to depart Cologne, he had amassed some 40,000 followers. Most of them were untrained and unarmed. A small handful of them were lesser knights. His host included women, children, and the elderly, and together they were gonna retake the Holy Land. They set off towards the end of April and made their way down to Hungary. This time, the King of Hungary was a little less interested in allowing crusaders through his lands, but in the end, he basically said to Peter, "Look, you guys can go through, but first you gotta swear that you're not gonna kill anybody or break my things." To which Peter, of course, agreed. All was going well until the crusade arrived at the very town that the French expedition had looted while waiting at the Byzantine border.
They haven't encountered
Some of the
any
peasant
Muslims
crusaders
yet,
got
they're
into a
already raising
dispute with a
hell.
merchant over a pair of shoes. This dispute became a brawl. This brawl became a riot. The riot then escalated into a battle, which culminated in one of the crusading knights leading a band of followers.
And it doesn't really matter what they do, because they get out of hell free for doing this. They're going to be all they have to. Well, at what point is their duty fulfilled? Do they have to win? And do they have to actually beat Muslims, or do they just have to go out there and just like, yeah, crusade? Who do they have to answer to? Like, it's all so vague that there's no, like, I don't know when their get out of hell free card comes into play. Like, when can they just go and do whatever they want?
Followers to storm the citadel of the city. They then stole the city's food, killed 4,000 Hungarians, and then hightailed it for...
My bad. That was my mistake. He did put that bishop guy in charge. You are correct. I already forgot that part. So there is somebody in charge. Clearly, not everybody's on the same page though. So, but yeah, thank you, Crimson Effort.
For the Byzantine border before the Hungarian army could show up. But now, the poor beleaguered Byzantine governor in Belgrade suddenly had 40,000 hungry, riotous peasants on his doorstep. He had heard of their behavior in Hungary, so he brought in a mercenary force to help keep the peace. They were to make sure that the Crusaders crossed the Sava River in a slow, orderly fashion, so the Byzantines could keep track of them and make sure that bands of Crusaders weren't just wandering the countryside. But, of course, the Crusaders felt that they weren't crossing the river fast enough. So
they needed to actually succeed to get the get out of hell free card. That might be a little bit more difficult.
They decided that the best course of action was to attack the Byzantine troops they were ostensibly there to help.
So if people die along the way, do they not get it? Like if they die, or do, like, if they die during the cause, and then but then the cause ends up succeeding, do they retroactively get their get out of hell free card? Or would they already be like, holy no, because they fought for the right cause? Like, I don't know if I was supposed to analyze the nuances of this. I don't know how much they thought about it.
For routing or killing the smaller Byzantine force, they then went pillaging and looting through the country until they got to Belgrade, which they pillaged, looted, and set on fire. The Crusaders then began to loot and sack their way towards Niš, the provincial capital. But our poor beleaguered Byzantine governor had been busy preparing the defenses of Niš while the ponderous Crusader army was on the march. He had called in as many troops as he could, and when the Crusader force got there, he met with Peter. He asked that Peter wait at Niš until a military escort could lead them to Constantinople. Peter agreed, but only on the condition that the governor feed his army while they wait. Now, 40,000 people is no small number to feed in medieval times, and soon the governor was faced with the choice of feeding the Crusaders or feeding his people. So the governor just told them to go, just head for Constantinople and leave him alone. But some of the German contingent decided to burn down a mill on their way out, which then escalated, and soon the governor had to call in the troops he'd been gathering at Niš to suppress the out-of-hand Crusaders. He gave his troops instructions to take hostages rather than killing when possible. Peter made his way to the very back of his column to see if he and the governor could come to an agreement and maybe his crusade could be allowed to go on its way. But by now, the mob of Crusaders were really completely out of Peter's control. They attacked the city of Niš itself. The garrison turned them away, but the defeated Crusaders just got a bigger mob together and attacked the walls of the city again. This time, our beleaguered Byzantine commander had had enough. He told his men to attack the Crusaders before they destroyed the provincial capital. The Crusaders were, of course, no match for trained, armed, and armored troops, and were decimated. Or I guess you could say quartered. Peter fled to the hills and hid, but by the time what remained of his army found him, a quarter of it was missing. Their supplies and money had also disappeared during the rout, and so the bedraggled band of beggars dragged itself to Constantinople, hungry, tired, and broke.
By the time they get there, they're screwed.
They met up with the French contingent that had left the west before them, and Peter...
They are an invading force, therefore they don't even have, like, home field advantage. They are... Their supply line is far more difficult. I don't know. It's all... Like, nothing here seems like it's going to work. Which, you know, seems to be the direction we're going. This might not end up working. Because you're going to attack people who are, like, entrenched in the place that you're invading. They've been here for hundreds of years. They're more prepared to defend it than you are to attack it, because you're not even there yet and you're already starving.
Along with the leader of the French force, Walter son of Wa, were summoned by the emperor. Despite everything, the emperor counseled them to wait for the real force of knights, which the Pope had assured him was on its way. But if they really wanted to go attack the Turks, he wasn't going to stop him. He would find some boats to ferry them across the Bosphorus. Of course, despite the warnings,
So we're still not even talking about the real thing here. Jeez.
Crusaders wanted to cross into enemy territory. So after 5 days of feeding 30,000 unexpected guests, the emperor
Christian.
assembled his boats and ferried them into Anatolia.
Gets a little confused
Once
sometimes.
across, they began to pillage town after town until they made it to Nicomedia. And remember, this was Byzantine territory a few short years ago. These are the very towns that Emperor Alexius had petitioned the Pope to help him get back. But beyond that, there is no question. These towns were Christian. But that distinction seemed lost on the Crusaders, and so pillage and loot they did. But once they reached Nicomedia, a quarrel broke out and the army fractured. The French contingent of the army stayed under the ostensible leadership of Peter, but the German and Italian portions broke off and elected to follow a knight named Reynold instead. From there, the two groups continued to pillage until they both ended up occupying the fortified coastal town of Civito. Peter urged them to hold up there until the main crusading force arrived, but by this point he had long since lost control. The two groups started making forays into the surrounding countryside, literally egging each other on. Each time one group would return from a raid, they'd boast and talk about how much braver they were, how much more they were doing for the cause, which would then inevitably lead to the other group doing something rasher, stupider, and more foolhardy to show how much braver they were and how much more they were doing for the cause. Peter, unable to control this, decided to leave the crusade and head back to Constantinople to ask for the emperor's help. But while he was heading back, the French forces decided that it would be a good idea to attack the local Turkish capital. They couldn't get through the walls, so instead they pillaged and butchered.
You're actually attacking Turks, though. Like, that's something. Like, we're making a little bit of progress towards what the original goal was. Just a little bit closer.
Everything around it, with atrocities ranging from systematic massacre of civilians to children being tossed on a fire. They considered this a job well done, and headed back to the base with more than the usual amount of self-congratulation.
The
German
boys.
contingent, not to be one-upped, then went out to capture a nearby castle. The garrison there was light, and the German crusaders were successful, but they forgot to check if the castle had any water stored up. Of course, the Turkish forces by this point had been mobilized, and they knew full well that the castle had no water reserves, and that the nearest well was way outside its walls. So the Turkish army pulled up and parked itself outside the castle. After a few days drinking the blood of donkeys and their own urine, the Crusaders surrendered. Upon surrender, the Turks demanded that the Crusaders either convert to Islam or be put to death. While many Crusaders refused to abandon their faith and were put to the sword, brave Sir Reynold, leader of the band, never a man to be outdone, surprised even the enemy commander when he not only offered to become a Muslim, but also offered to join the Turks and make war against the Christians if they'd spare his life. Meanwhile, word, probably intentionally spread by the Turks, filtered back to the...
That was just like, it's kind of a greeting. Assalamu alaikum. I don't know if I might have butchered the pronunciation there. And, yeah, and you respond, Va alaikum assalam.
French Crusaders that the German group had not only captured a castle, but actually captured the Turkish capital as well. An argument broke out in the camp. Some thought that they should wait for Peter to return, which he never would, while others thought that if they waited, they'd miss out on all the good looting. Soon, the faction supporting looting won out, because of course it did, and every single remaining Crusader, about 20,000 of them, marched out of their base toward the capital, under the leadership of one Geoffrey Burrell. About 3 miles from the Crusader base, in a narrow wooded valley, the full might of the Turkish forces lay in wait. The disorganized Crusaders, rushing up the road in an effort to make it to the capital in time for plunder, didn't even notice the trap. As a hail of arrows poured out of the woods, the Crusaders began to rout almost immediately. Turkish horsemen thundered out of the woods, chasing down the Crusaders almost to a man. Of the 40,000 peasant Crusaders who had left Western Europe, only 3,000, following their brave leader Geoffrey Burrell, managed to flee fast enough to escape. Those 3,000 managed to hole up in an old abandoned castle until the Byzantines came to rescue them. So let's just review the Crusade scorecard so far. Hungarian citizens killed? Thousands. Byzantine citizens killed? Also thousands. German Jews killed? Again, thousands. Crusaders killed? Tens of thousands. Christians killed? Tens of thousands. Turks killed? A few, most of them civilians. Massive economic disruption to the Eastern Roman Empire? Check. Eastern Roman forces who the Crusaders were supposed to be helping attacked? Check. Potential allies in Muslim territory ransacked? Check. And Holy Lands retaken? 0.
Nope.
And thus, the First Crusade began. Join us next time to find out what the barons have been doing during these shenanigans, see how the better-equipped barons and princes fare against the Turks, and watch the First Crusade actually begin.
We're a third of the way into this thing, and like we're finally about to get to the beginning of it. I think somebody said this is like the equivalent of like the tailgate thing. I don't know, something. It was clever when the person said it in the chat. We're just now actually going to be getting into the Crusades. In this early stage, when it's just a bunch of guys going around killing civilians, I'm just thinking like, man, I hope the Turks destroyed these guys. And like, I'm not one who's like inclined to root for them under normal circumstances. I'm sure there's plenty of things I would disagree with them on norm-wise, like when you force people to convert to your religion or die, like that's generally a negative thing. But I think these guys, they were kind of crummy, and I'm kind of cool with you doing whatever you gotta do to them, because they were kind of awful. I'm wondering if I'm going to continue rooting for the Turks as we get into the rest of this, as we get into like the actual crusade. And I don't actually have any allegiance when it comes to this stuff. I don't really have much. I didn't have much bias going into it. I just assumed everybody involved would be awful, but it's just like these guys are like annoyingly awful. They're not just awful, they're just incompetent, which is also kind of upsetting. It's like they're trying to play a game they're totally unqualified for. You don't even know the rules, man. You can't even get into my side of the club. Part 3. So we're about to conclude the first half of the series. There's only 6 episodes of this, right?
The disastrous People's Crusade had met its end at the hand of the Seljuk Turks, and Peter, along with the few thousand remaining of those who joined him, were hiding out in Constantinople, awaiting the arrival of the real Crusaders. Today, finally, that real crusade will begin. But before the First Crusade can begin in earnest, the Crusaders have to get to the Holy Land. And to do that, we have to recognize one very important point about the First Crusade that's often overlooked. The army of the First Crusade isn't actually one army at all. Rather, it's at least 5 separate armies led by 5 different men from 5 different parts of Europe. Each of them set out from 5 different starting points with the idea that they'd all meet up in Constantinople and move on to the Holy Land from there. The first army is that of Hugh of Vermandois. This was the smallest army, although arguably the noblest of the noble armies, as Hugh was the brother of the King of France. Which was a bit awkward, as the Pope had recently excommunicated King Philip I of France for adultery, but hey, why let fraternal excommunication get in the way of a good crusade? Now, from Western Europe, there are basically 2 ways to get to Constantinople. Travel over land through Hungary, or head to Italy and travel by sea. Hugh chose the latter of these 2 options. Unfortunately, his tiny fleet was hit by a storm, and he lost a good number of his ships. But eventually, the Byzantines fished the remaining Crusaders out of the Adriatic and escorted them to Constantinople, where Hugh promptly sent a message to the emperor that read, "Know, O king, that I am king of kings, and superior to all who are under the sky. You are now permitted to greet me on my arrival, and to receive me with magnificence, as befits my nobility." Needless to say, the emperor was not impressed.
That seems like a bit much.
The second army on our list was that of Godfrey de Bouillon. He represented the German contingent.
King of Kings. That's kind of like, in a lot of ways, that's something that Jesus. That's like a title that would be given to like Jesus. So that level of arrogance and self-importance might be a bit off-putting to a religious crowd. I don't know. I don't know if his marketing's going to go very well.
Of the Crusades, and brought a sizable force from the Holy Roman Empire, which is only a little bit awkward as he had actually fought against the Pope when the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were duking it out, and in fact, he directly helped kick the Pope out of Rome, but hey, why let a few armed legions supporting the anti-Pope to kick the legitimate Pope out of Rome get in the way of a good crusade? He and his brother, Baldwin, leaving from only about 200 miles south of where Peter's crusade set out, decided to take the same route that Peter did. But this time, when the King of Hungary saw a group of Crusaders pulling up on his doorstep, he was like, no, 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 no. But after a lot of talking, the King of Hungary finally allowed Godfrey to pass through on the condition that Godfrey's brother Baldwin and his entire family stay as hostages. After making it through Hungary without a single looting, Godfrey planned to resupply at Belgrade, but wait, no, Peter had burnt that to the ground. Oops. Now, our poor beleaguered Byzantine governor must have been preparing himself for yet another round of terrible conflict with the Crusaders, but Godfrey's army, like a champ, managed to make it through to Constantinople with only a tiny, itty-bitty bit of pillaging. Next, we have the army of Bohemond, Prince of Taranto.
Impressive?
The force he brought was smaller than most of the others, but it was by far the best.
Considering the time, it was very difficult to keep your people from pillaging. Like, the amount of distance that they're covering, like, the lack of a steady supply line, you're often relying very much on what you can acquire along the way. So to only have a little bit of pillaging is actually a little bit impressive, I suppose. It's like a participation trophy level of like it's you didn't do a good job, but you did something.
Best armed and the most experienced, which is a little bit awkward because most of these troops got their experience trying to conquer the Byzantine Empire 12 years before. But why let unprovoked acts of naked aggression and the near unseating of the very ruler you're now supposed to go help get in the way of a good crusade? So, after sailing across the Adriatic and a ponderously slow march across the Balkans, where their men occasionally wholesale looted the very same people they looted a decade and a half ago in the war, Bohemond and his nephew Tancred finally made it to Constantinople. After Bohemond, we have the army of Raymond, the Count of Toulouse. Raymond led the largest army and what can be considered the principal crusading force. As such, Raymond considered himself to be leader of the crusade, which is only a little awkward as he traveled alongside Bishop Adhemar, the papal legate assigned by the Pope as the leader of the crusade. But Raymond was also old, missing one eye, and stated that he hoped to die in the Holy Land, so why let a little leadership dispute get in the way of a good crusade? Raymond and his forces chose to follow the overland route to Constantinople. Unfortunately, when they got to the Balkans, they ended up passing through a lot of the same territory that Bohemond did, which meant that the people there were hostile, and the land was already stripped bare. This left Raymond's gigantic force hungry and grumpy, and by this point, we all know what hungry, grumpy crusaders do. During the pillaging, Bishop Adhemar was wounded and had to stay behind for a bit to recover. What's more, Raymond was called off to Constantinople to meet with the emperor personally, leaving no one really in charge of the largest crusading army. This huge unsupervised army then managed to get itself in a tussle with Byzantine forces, and, as is the pattern, got itself routed. But eventually, Raymond's remaining men limped their way to Constantinople. Lastly, we have the army of Robert of Flanders, who surprisingly had nothing awkward going on at all, as his father had gone on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem a few years back, and had fought for Alexius Comnenus on the way, leaving the family on good terms with the Byzantines. Like Bohemond and Hugh, Robert also decided to try his hand at the sea route, and surprisingly, he managed to make the crossing to Byzantine territory without losses. Even more surprisingly, he managed to make it all the way to Constantinople without any major reports of pillaging or looting.
Good job, Robert. Gold star. You actually did a good job. You actually managed to do a good job. You're the first. I like you, Robert of Flanders, so far. Though I think you're on a bit of a silly mission. Thus far, you've not done anything wrong. Though one could say you're on your way to do something very, very wrong. But you don't know it's wrong. You're just listening to the Pope. I mean, when did a pope in the Middle Ages ever steer anybody wrong?
But there were two other fellows leading this crusading army along with Robert. One Robert of Normandy, just to make things confusing, and a Stephen of Blois, both of whom were relations of William the Conqueror. They decided that the crossing was too risky and that they were going to wait until spring to cross. That would generally be a wise decision, though in this case they would end up losing one of their ships where Robert had lost none. And while they waited in Italy, a fair number of crusaders decided that a winter in Italy isn't what they signed up for, and deserted. All right, I think that's everybody. Now that all the Crusaders
You're
are
all
in Constantinople, the real party
Needed
starts.
some Nords
At least
on
for the
this
leaders of the Crusade, it does. You see, Alexius Komnenos, being a savvy guy, basically trusted none of these people. So he decided that before he'd ferry them across the Bosphorus, he'd get all the leaders to swear that as they crusaded, they would return any previously Byzantine territory they conquered to the Byzantine Empire. That's the entire reason Alexius got this ball rolling in the first place, after all. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with some of the crusading leaders, so Alexius decided to talk to them privately, one by one. It turned out that Hugh, in this as in most things, was a bit of a pushover. Godfrey, on the other hand, turned out to be absolutely bonkers. He just straight up refused to go to the imperial palace to meet with Alexius at all. So far as I can tell, he didn't really give any reason for this either. He had come all the way to Constantinople, and now he just sat outside doing nothing. Emperor Alexius finally decided, okay, I'll send Hugh to talk to him, I guess. But when Hugh showed up, Godfrey called him a lackey and refused to deal with anyone less than the emperor. Okay. This weird standoff continued until, finally, after Alexius cut off the supplies he'd been sending him, Godfrey's troops attacked imperial troops. There was a minor skirmish, Godfrey's troops lost, and so far as I can discern, Godfrey just instantly caved. The emperor gave Godfrey a small mound of treasure and basically just said, "Get out of here," and booted his forces over the Bosphorus. Okay, that's 2 down. Now it was Bohemon's turn, and he was a wily one. Now, whatever else you may say about Bohemond, he was charming, intelligent, diplomatic, and shrewd. Alexius knew that Bohemond probably wasn't there just out of crusading zeal, as this was the same Bohemond who had tried to dethrone him a few years ago. Alexius was bracing...
Yeah, but that happened, like, casually at the time, so, you know, you take what you can get from people. Really, it seems like there is a lot... during this period, a lot of just embracing your enemies, because it's just kind of a common fact of life that you know, DTA, but you also got to be able to get whatever you can out of them when it's convenient. So, okay. As absurd as it sounds, understanding how absurd the time that they're living in is... You know, I'm not even going to question it.
Himself for an argument to get Bohemond to agree to give back whatever conquests he might gain on the crusade. But Bohemond was one step ahead. He agreed right away. Of course he would take the oath. But since he was being so forthcoming, wouldn't it make sense for the emperor to name him as the leader of the crusade? What? Alexius stumbled for a moment here, but he too was a savvy and shrewd man, and so rapidly regained his bearing, said something non-committal like, yeah, I probably could, hang on. And then quickly shuffled Bohemond off to a room literally overflowing with gold and jewels and silver, and basically said, "What? Look at all this annoying treasure just clogging up my otherwise lovely room. Wow, that's a nuisance. If only I had a buddy here who could cart it all off for me after saying one measly little oath." And measly little oaths were indeed said. But this whole time, Bohemond's nephew Tancred was outside with the army, miles from the city, and so managed to just sort of never take the oath himself. This may end up being relevant to future extra history episodes. Raymond was next. He met with the emperor, but flat out refused to take the oath. He went on a whole spiel saying, "God is my only leader," and that he would not swear to such a thing. Eventually, Alexius managed to get him to at least swear to an oath of brohood. A broth, if you will, proclaiming that Alexius was his bro forever and that he would help him wherever he could, especially against that weasel Bohemond. Alexius eventually said, "All right, good enough," and sent him on his way. No presents for you, though. Presents are for people who swear actual oaths. Lastly, of course, there was Robert. Their conversation boiled down to, "Are we cool?" "Yeah, we're cool." Then Alexius showered him with gifts and said, "Go get him, Tiger."
So far.
And thus began the First Crusade.
As good
Seriously,
as a Crusader
the First
gets,
Crusade
I guess.
is actually beginning now. Next week, we'll see them march off into Turkish territory, fight battles against people who aren't supposed to be their allies, and actually retake land for Christendom. See you then.
Damn, we're actually doing something. It took us half the series to get organized, but honestly, that's kind of the pacing of a lot of extra history series. They spend a lot of time on the build-up, and that's absolutely necessary. And that's my favorite stuff. You get to the climax, and I'm like, that's fine. I want to see the build-up and the fallout. That's what I'm interested in. I don't care about battles or whatever. I want to see consequences and just complex political webs that build up to conflicts. Part 4, Men of Iron. Cool.
And so, at
That's
last, the Crusades
right
sailed across the Bosphorus. All 5 of the crusading armies and the remnants of the Peasants' Crusade joining into one massive force to retake the Holy Land. The Crusaders finally passed out of Christian territory. They weren't on Allied ground anymore. For once, any damage they did would actually be to the enemy they were summoned to fight. The First Crusade really had begun. But as the ships crossed the Bosphorus and disgorged their cargo of men and mail and plate, of giant destriers barded for war, of crossbowmen counting their quarrels, they were met with a silent, empty plain. One after another, the Crusader forces arrived, and they waited. Anatolia was quiet. Too quiet. No Turkish horde came to sweep them back into the Bosphorus. No Saracen...
The Emperor's daughter was a fangirl of Bohemond. Oh, jeez. I could only imagine what that was actually like.
Riders came to pour waves of arrows down on their crusading band. And so the princes met, discussed, and decided that they would move their forces to Nicaea, a few days' march away, with Godfrey de Bouillon at the head of the band. Nicaea was an important city. It was strategically important. It held the road to Jerusalem. If they couldn't take it, they'd have to march a much more difficult path with an incredible enemy stronghold at their back. Nicaea was also symbolically important. The First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea, had once been called there by the Emperor Constantine himself to determine what was orthodox for the Christian world. And it was politically important. When Kilij Arslan took over the Sultanate of Rum, he took Nicaea for his capital. It housed the royal treasury and the family of the Sultan. So the crusading forces marched on Nicaea.
That's all very
Godfrey
important.
and Bohemond and Tancred arrived first, followed by Raymond and Robert of Flanders. One by one, they set up the siege. And still, nothing happened. Still no Turks. This was getting weird. So, in the eerie quiet, the Crusader army broke into its component parts again, and each army took a section of the high, ancient Roman walls to lay siege to.
It was like they've been working on this for a while.
Bohemond and Tancred set up around the east. Raymond was still dawdling towards Nicaea, but the other two figured he could hold the southern wall when he got there. As for the west, well, one of the key features of Nicaea is that it sits on the lake Ascania, and this is no small lake, it's about 115 square miles. The western wall of Nicaea abuts the lake itself, so the Crusaders figured, well, we don't really need to guard that. And thus, the Crusaders set up around the walls of Nicaea and promptly began to starve. But Bohemond, a seasoned military man, set up a system of naval resupply with the Byzantines. With that handled, the real work of sitting around could get started. Just as Raymond finally dawdled into place, the Turks at last arrived. Kilij Arslan, at the head of about 10,000 horse archers, thundered down in the plain surrounding the city.
Oh, dude,
then he saw just how many Crusaders he was facing, and turned right around and thundered off in the other direction. The Crusaders gave chase with their heavy steeds, but as the Turkish horses were faster, the Crusaders inflicted only light casualties on Kilij Arslan's force. Still, they had routed them. The Crusaders celebrated. They held the field, and morale was lifted. It was time to get back to the siege. Now,
okay, now whatever comes next will be a more accurate measure of what this conflict is going to be like. Up until now, now we have people who have gauged the size of the enemy army and gotten away. So that now they know how much they have to send roughly, and they kind of have a general idea where everybody is. Now we're actually going to get into what may be a slightly more even fight.
Each of the crusading forces had a different idea on how the siege should go. Some were trying to wait it out. Others were building siege engines. Others were digging under the walls, but none of this seemed to have much effect. Finally, it dawned on them that the western wall on the lake was a little more important than maybe they had first thought. Turns out, the garrison at Nicaea was secretly getting resupplied by boats coming over the lake at night. That kinda threw a wrench in this whole siege plan. The Crusaders didn't have enough forces to guard the entire coast of that enormous lake, and they didn't have a navy of their own to stop the resupply either. But if they didn't somehow prevent supplies from getting into the city, the defenders could practically hold out forever. So what do? Well, in a feat of logistics that could only be achieved by the heirs of Rome, the Byzantines came to the rescue. They sailed a group of ships to the harbor at Kivito, hauled them out of the water, put them on rollers, and dragged them to Nicaea. The next day, with as much fanfare as possible, the Byzantine ships began an assault from the lake, while the Crusaders assaulted the walls of the city from the shore. And soon, with their resupply cut off and their reinforcements driven back, the people of Nicaea offered to surrender. But here's where it gets complicated, because who do you surrender to? There were basically 5 crusading armies and the Byzantine surrounding the city.
Ideally,
to make it even
they're
more
all
complicated, the garrison
thing.
in the city, the only guys with weapons, were all Muslim Turks, while the population of the city, who vastly outnumbered them, were Orthodox Christians who used to be part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Oh, and not to mention the fact that the Sultan's wife and family were still in the city, as was the Sultan's treasury. So the negotiations began. But as the Crusaders were negotiating, they were also periodically assaulting the city.
They've got to negotiate with each other.
Somehow, magically, the 2,000 Byzantine troops scaled the walls and captured the city, a feat which tens of thousands of Crusaders hadn't been able to achieve. That might seem like an incredible military feat, but remember, this is Emperor Alexius Komnenos we're talking about, and he was always a crafty guy. He knew that if the Crusaders got a hold of Nicaea, they would loot it until it burned to the ground, and then maybe not even give it back to him afterwards. That would not do.
He's planning on them failing.
He had secretly made a deal with basically everybody inside the city to just let him take it. He let the Turks go free, he ensured the safety of the Sultan's family, he brought the people of Nicaea back into the imperial fold, and promised them protection from ransacking. And in return, they just sort of let his troops over the walls. Once the city was firmly in his hands, he let the Crusaders in small groups, and always under guard. But he tried to placate the Crusaders with gifts, to varying degrees of effect. He also tried to get them to reaffirm their oath to him to return Byzantine territory, also with varying degrees of effect. And so the Byzantines remained garrisoned in Nicaea, and the Crusaders prepared to press on. But hang on, what exactly was going on with the Turks this whole time? Why hadn't they showed up until it was too late? Where was Kilij Arslan the whole time the crusade was marching on Nicaea? Well, have I got a surprise twist for you? I bet you thought this whole time that that whole Peasants Crusade thing was useless, perhaps even more than useless. Well, ha! Turns out, by dying so pathetically in such large numbers so quickly, they had convinced Kilij Arslan that the crusading forces were not worth worrying about. And so, by heroically being such utter and unmitigated failures, the Peasants' Crusade had lulled the Sultan into thinking he had far more pressing things to deal with than these silly French people who kept showing up on his shores. Like medieval Europe, the Islamic states were also always involved in minor wars against one another, and the Sunni-Shia split led some in Europe to believe that the Muslim sects were more likely to ally with the Crusaders against one another than actually band together to fight. And when the Crusaders had landed, Kilij Arslan had been off in the eastern part of his realm dealing with border disputes from one of the other Islamic states. He had actually been informed of the Crusaders landing almost immediately, but he figured they'd probably bumble themselves to death before he'd even get there, and that his garrisons could deal with whatever trouble they might create anyway. In one of the great ironies of history, if the Peasants' Crusade hadn't expired en masse without doing any real damage, the Princes' Crusade might have been swept back into the sea before it ever had a chance to group up and gather steam. But gather it had, and now the Crusade began to head south. But finding supply too difficult to manage, they split again into two forces. A smaller force led by Bohemond and Tancred in the vanguard, and a larger force with Godfrey, Raymond, Stephen, and Hugh behind. After about 4 days' march, as dawn broke and Bohemond's forces began to wake in a small valley outside Dorylaeum, Turks started to pour out of the surrounding hills.
This is one of the images that you always see when you see stuff about the Crusades, the horsemen. That's always like one of the more popular images you see when depicting the Turks. One thing that we are missing is the absurd, like, I guess, the helmets from the Crusaders. I don't know how historical the helmets are, and maybe they're not from this crusade, but the ones that are like big tin cans. Yeah, I don't know how historical those helmets are, but that's the other image that I get, and I don't know where that comes from.
All valley outside Dorylaeum, if any of you know, Turks started to pour out of the surrounding hills. Kilij Arslan was not done yet. The Turks whirled in and out of the camp, slaughtering civilians and unarmored combatants. Individual knights tried to arm and mount amidst the chaos. Those who could tried heroically but futilely, often alone or in small gathered groups, to charge the fluid Turkish line. At last, Bohemond, riding furiously up and down the camp, shouted to his knights to dismount, lock shields, and defend the civilians. They formed a circle and tried to bring those without protection inside. The Turks rained arrows down on the knights in an unending stream, and yet they stood, stolid and unmoving. In one of the most impressive acts of discipline in all of the Crusades, the knights held their line for hours, never being baited into charging, never breaking formation as men fell from the deadly hail. Inside the circle, people screamed as stray arrows made it over the wall of armor and shields and occasionally found their mark. Then the priests inside the circle began to sing, and those nearby began to sing with them. And the sun rose, and the men still held, battered by such mortal rain, baking in the heat of Anatolia, wearing full mail armor under the blistering sun. Then the women began to bring water to the line of knights, risky though it was to try. And still, the knights did one of the most difficult things for any army in any time. Simply take...
I think those, referring to the helmets, I think those are a feature of later Crusades. That's what I was assuming. Like, if they were a thing, that would be later on. They haven't captured their crusading image yet. They'll get there. But that's something that I'm interested in. We have a thing on the Third Crusades coming eventually, so hopefully I'll get some weird helmets during that time, and I need somebody to explain those to me.
Take fire for hours without moving, without breaking, without ever being able to attack back at their foe.
Like you could see
and
well.
The line held. Slowly throughout the day, small forces of Crusaders arrived. Godfrey, with some 50 knights, abandoned his main force and cut his way to the embattled Bohemond, as did men of Hugh's forces. Then, at last, after 7 straight hours of sun and arrows, Raymond's force arrived and slammed into the Turkish flank, surprising them completely. As he did so, Bohemond and Godfrey ordered the men to remount, abandon the shield wall, and charge the Turkish line, with a mighty cry of, "Today, if God's willing, we'll all be rich!" I'm completely serious, that was the battle cry, just a bit more Latin. Reeling, Kilij Arslan pulled back to a hilltop to defend. The fighting was fierce until at last, a force led by Bishop Adhemar of all people, snuck around behind the Turks, burned their camp, and charged them from the rear. The Turkish line fell apart, and the way to Antioch was left open to the exhausted Crusaders. Join us next time for the March to Antioch, the trials of the desert, and a liberal interpretation of the meaning of oaths.
Sounds interesting. So we're going into episode 5. I thought we were on episode 5 already. I was about to say that's pretty quick to be getting into the end, but no, we still have a third of this to go. I'm down with just running through it. It's always fun hearing like old Catholics really going on about wealth. Like, the battle cry was about wealth, and, as the Bible says, God will bring you wealth, and then you smash through the eye of the needle into heaven using that wealth, or something. I don't know. It's just like how, like, anti-wealth a lot of the doctrine really is. How minimalistic it calls on people to live their lives, and I think these people have an excuse, because a lot of them probably were not literate, could not read the Bible themselves, and found whatever meaning in it that was given to them. I mean, they're being told stuff by higher church authorities. It doesn't really matter what's in the book that a lot of them can't read, because that's not where they're getting a lot of their ideas about their own religion. This is kind of a thing where it's literally a crusade. The ends justify the means by definition with what they're doing. So it doesn't really matter what they believe, and they're getting a get into heaven free card anyway. So I guess they can care about wealth all they want. Doesn't matter what their beliefs are, they're going to heaven anyway. If they win. Presumably. And they're doing alright so far, despite
After the Battle of Dorylaeum, the way lay open to the south, towards Antioch, towards Jerusalem. But the Turks, though beaten, were far from broken. In their retreat, they stripped the land and laid waste to anything they couldn't take with them. And as the crusade moved south, the heat intensified. King Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, had ordered the wells along the path destroyed, and in the sun-scorched plains of Anatolia, thirst began to stalk the ranks of the crusade. Parched animals laid by the roadside to die. Men chewed thorns for moisture. The crusade left a trail of the dead. But finally, the crusade crossed into the fertile valleys of Iconium, where they restocked and made the trek across to Heraclea. Here, the Council of Princes met to discuss their next move. Two paths lay open to them. One dangerous but quicker through the Taurus Mountains, and the other a slower but less risky path over the confusingly named Anti-Taurus Mountains. The majority of the army chose to follow the safer route, but Tancred and Baldwin set out on the harder trek. Tancred brought a few hundred knights with him, while Baldwin detached over 2,000 soldiers from his brother Godfrey's army for the adventure. Tancred's group set off first, and soon came upon the port town of Tarsus. After quickly driving the garrison back into the city, he realized he had a problem. He had nowhere near enough men to take a walled city like Tarsus, so Tancred sent word back to his uncle Bohemond to send along reinforcement. But as the writer was heading back to the main force with the message, Tancred had a flash of brilliance. He quickly had his men surround the town and make it look like they were preparing for a siege. Then he sent word to the Turkish garrison that he was but the vanguard of an enormous force of crusaders who would soon sweep over Tarsus and do horrible things to any Turks defending its walls. Most of the Turkish garrison quietly snuck out of the town that night. The rest offered to surrender in the morning. Now, you remember a couple episodes ago how Tancred had managed to slip through Constantinople without swearing an oath to the Byzantine emperor? Well, the garrison flew Tancred's banner over the town, and he declared it his city. This lasted all of about 15 minutes before Baldwin arrived. Baldwin, who was much less concerned with subtlety, and apparently oaths, saw the banner and basically said, "Hey, what a fabulous idea. I love it. But I have 2,000 men, so why don't you let me have that city instead?" Tancred grumbled under his breath about how he had both beaten back the garrison and tricked them into abandoning the city, but he couldn't really fault Baldwin's logic. 2,000 was indeed more than a few hundred, so he packed up his camp and grumpily started to head east. With Tancred gone, Baldwin's banner now flew over the city. But guess who shows up? The reinforcements Tancred had sent for before coming up with that ruse to take the city. Now, these men must have been a little miffed to have trekked all that way for nothing, but Baldwin, never a very secure man, and never one to miss an opportunity to add insult to injury, refused to even let them into the city for the night, instead forcing them to take camp outside the city walls. Then, to add real injury to injury, remember how the Turkish garrison had slipped out in the middle of the night? Well, they were still out there, and in the middle of the night, they descended on the Crusaders camped outside the walls and slaughtered them as they slept. Those Turks really got a lot done at the middle of the night. Bunch of night owls. They were productive. As you can imagine, when the town woke up and saw a few hundred dead Crusaders outside, well, no one was very happy with Baldwin. In response, he heroically locked himself in a building and refused to come out until people calmed down. Tancred, meanwhile, was off conquering the next town. This time, though, when Baldwin caught up and arrived outside the walls, things went a little differently. Tancred had augmented his force with local Armenian volunteers, and by the time Baldwin showed up at this new city, Tancred was well entrenched inside the city walls. So, when Baldwin asked to be let in, it was Tancred's turn to say, nah, I think you get to sleep outside. But, not content with letting Baldwin get off so lightly after letting their compatriots die, some of Tancred's knights ended up charging Baldwin's camp, and the Crusaders started a brawl outside the newly conquered city. And then, Baldwin basically wandered off and abandoned the crusade. Baldwin headed east. He met an heirless king. He got the heirless king to adopt him. He promptly let the heirless king be assassinated. He ordered the man who introduced him to said king, who was theoretically his friend, to be tortured to death, and he declared himself Count of Edessa. And thus, the first Crusader state is born. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, Edessa had once been part of the Byzantine Empire. Yes, Baldwin had sworn the oath, and no, he was not going to give it back. And not to spoil future series, but he ends up becoming king of Jerusalem. Anyway, Tancred, meanwhile, rejoined the main crusade, and captured a few more towns relevant to the effort along the way. When he rejoined, though, the crusade was a bit worse for wear. Mail armor and mountain climbing don't mix, and the safer road through the Anti-Taurus mountains had only proven to be slightly safer. At this point, they'd lost most of their horses to the heat and abandoned much of their armor in the mountains. And in front of them stood the great and ancient city of Antioch. A city founded under Alexander, made great by Rome, and fortified by Justinian. It was the last great obstacle between the Crusaders and Jerusalem. but the massive walls constructed by Justinian were too much for the Crusaders.
So we're not going to be in
Jerusalem, which flew off from the city like
episode,
wings high into the mountains, made the city impossible to encircle. The massive stones and impressive towers Justinian's men had built were more than these Crusaders could breach. So the Crusaders decided on a plan, albeit one of the oddest siege plans I've ever heard of. They were going to have contingents blockade most, but not quite all, of the city's gates, which would seem to defeat the point of a siege, but some of those gates lay high atop the nearby mountains, and others lay behind a river which would split the Crusaders' forces. So the Crusaders decided to simply block what gates they could and wait. But as the weeks and then months passed and fall turned into winter, the crusade began to starve. The local area was stripped bare, so any foraging party would have to go far afield and risk being ambushed if they were to resupply the army. So the princes decided on a daring plan. Bohemond and Robert of Flanders would take a sizable part of the army with them to forage in force, while the remnants of the Crusader army would try to maintain the siege. So Robert and Bohemond headed off, but as their foraging party reached the tiny village of Albara, what did they see? A large Muslim army marching down the very road to Antioch they were heading up to forage. The Muslim force was as surprised as the Crusaders, and after a few minutes of everyone just blinking at each other in shock, the Crusaders, though outnumbered and laden with forage, charged. When the dust cleared, many were dead on both sides. There was no clear victor, and the Crusaders had lost all the forage they'd set out to acquire. But, in one of the strange twists of luck that accompanied the First Crusade, the commander of the relieving Muslim force, who was never that into being a relieving force, looked at the casualty list and decided, well, so much for that, and packed up his army and went home.
And
Antioch's reinforcements were gone. The Crusaders were still starving, though, and that's not all. There were
like, in a sense, I'm curious about the Muslim perspective in this war. To the Christians, it's very much a holy war. But to these guys, these are just outside invaders coming in. Yeah, there's religious connotations to the conflict, obviously, but I'd imagine it doesn't have the same religious gravity that comes from a war declared by the Pope, like in the name of religion. I'd imagine for the Muslims in this situation, it's more of a political conflict. So I'd imagine it would be a little bit easier to abandon the conflict, though it doesn't seem like the religious nature of it has kept all the Christians from abandoning the conflict or going against, I guess, what is established to be the right thing to do.
Earthquakes and comets, even auroras. And Crusaders were generally the superstitious type, so after seeing all that, a lot of them began to slink off and abandon the crusade, including none other than Peter the Hermit. Bishop Adhemar quickly hauled some of these recalcitrant Crusaders back to Antioch, including Peter, and then followed up with a brilliant plan. He called for a fast to regain the favor of God, which is a pretty clever way to improve morale and solve your supply problems. At long last, and
the Kings and Generals channel has a video on that, the Islamic point of view of the Crusades. That's probably something that would be kind of useful here, because this is a very Christian-centric point of view. And I think that's fair, because ideologically it seems to, well, it's clearly provoked by a Christian perspective. However, there's a lot of layers that I'm sure would be interesting to learn about from the Muslims' side of the story.
Much worse for wear, the Crusaders made it through to spring, and the food situation started to improve. And then Bohemond got tricky. He convinced the leader of the Byzantine contingent that there was a plot to kill him. When the Byzantines reacted by going back to Constantinople, Bohemond accused them of cowardice and abandonment, treacherous behavior which he claimed freed him of his oath to Emperor Komnenos. Now, with another Turkish reinforcing army bearing down on the crusade, he threatens to abandon the Siege of Antioch unless he was allowed to keep the city when they took it. Godfrey and Raymond grumbled about this, but there was only so much they could do, as the lesser knights loved Bohemond. You have to give Bohemond some credit, though, because after this, he proceeded to lay out and execute a plan that not only thrashed the Second Turkish Relief Army headed for Antioch, but also inflicted a great number of casualties on the garrison. And thus the siege survived to drag on into summer. Then the Turks assembled a third great army to relieve Antioch, this one far too large for the Crusaders to meet in open battle. But Bohemond hadn't spent the months idly. He managed
to find
a guard commander in the city who was bribable. and just before the arrival of the Turkish army, the bribed commander let the Crusaders over the walls in the dead of night. The massacre was horrific and indiscriminate, but by dawn, with many civilians amongst the dead, the Crusaders had captured all of Antioch except the citadel, which stood atop a mountain at the end of its long walls. Join us next time as the besiegers become the besieged, as we witness the epitome of horror, and as, at last, the Crusaders make it to Jerusalem.
Oh, we're getting to the climax here. This is it. We're entering Jerusalem. Like, even if they win, they also have to, like, maintain what they have, which would be its own kind of story. I don't believe they got much out of this one, though. If this is the Crusade, I think it is. Like, I learned about, like, 2 out of the 4 Crusades a little bit in a class on the Middle Ages that I took years ago at this point. Wow, time just, it's gone. I lost a lot of time because of the pandemic. Like, it all just kind of merged together. It feels like that was, like, last semester, but it's been over 2 years. Jeez. On to Jerusalem!
Last we left off, the Crusaders had just taken Antioch. Now they have to hold it. There's just a small series of problems. 1, the Turkish army bearing down on them has now surrounded Antioch. 2, the Turkish garrison in Antioch still holds the citadel, which is inside the city walls. 3, Antioch is almost out of food after that prolonged siege the Crusaders themselves put it under. 4, the day before they took Antioch, Stephen of Blois just decided that everything was hopeless and abandoned the crusade, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days. 5, to compound his desertion, on his way back, Stephen ran into the Byzantine relief army and told them all hope was lost. So the Byzantines were like, okay, and promptly turned around to defend their own territory. So there would be no Byzantine reinforcements arriving. But for 4 straight days, the Turks assaulted the walls, and for 4 days, the beleaguered Crusaders held. Bohemond desperately racing between containing the Turks in the citadel and trying to hold the wall. Godfrey rallying the troops. The Turks attacked in waves to keep their forces fresh, but there were already too few Crusaders to hold the great ramparts, and so they fought without relief. After 4 days of vicious combat, the Turks decided, you know what, let's just starve these guys out. So, once again, starvation set in, and Crusader morale began to drop. Things looked bleak,
closer to home.
Then, a sign. An impoverished local mystic claimed to have had a vision of St. Andrew telling him where the lance of Longinus, the holy lance that supposedly pierced Christ's side, was buried. So the Crusaders started to dig a big hole in the floor of the Church of St. Peter in Antioch. The mystic jumped down into the pit, and lo and behold, he pulled out a hunk of iron. "We found it," he said, "the head of the lance of Longinus." Bohemond and Tancred were skeptical, and Bishop Adhemar was having none of it. They already had one of those holy lance things back in Rome, but the ordinary soldiers were inspired. Raymond declared it a...
There's so many artifacts of this kind. I didn't know as much about this one specifically, but like artifacts that are apparently connected to Jesus. They say that, I forgot how the expression goes, but like there are apparently a lot of pieces of the cross that Jesus died on, and they say that there are so many pieces that if you put them all together, you could build Noah's Ark. So, some of them are clearly not real. So when it comes to holy artifacts with like direct connections to Jesus and stuff, always be skeptical. Always.
Sign that they would prevail. 13 days later, with food running out, the gaunt and wild-eyed Crusaders rode out of the gates to attack the Turks. Carrying the lance of Longinus, and with the fervor of men otherwise doomed, the Crusaders let out a great yell and charged the vastly superior Turkish force. 6 columns of men, each led by one of the lords of the crusade, poured out of the city gates and slammed into the Turkish line. Later, soldiers would speak of having seen the saints riding amongst them, carrying banners of white and riding steeds like snow. And with desperation they fought. The Turks lit a great fire to drive them back, but through flame and smoke they fought on, until at last, against all odds, the Turkish line collapsed. The Crusaders fell upon the Turkish camp and the stores held there. The crusade had survived. Unbeknownst to the Crusaders, though, they'd had one advantage. While the Turkish host appeared to them to be one mighty army, it was actually, like the crusading force, made up of many smaller armies with their own commanders. And it turns out that many of those commanders would have rather seen the Crusaders keep Antioch than have it fall into the hands of their superior. So as soon as the battle began to turn, many of them used it as an excuse to just desert and flee. But no matter the cause, the Crusaders had overcome the last great obstacle between them and Jerusalem.
That makes sense.
Now the crusade would be complete in no time, right? Not exactly. Raymond and Bohemond immediately began to dispute who would get to keep Antioch. Bohemond, always a little slyer than Raymond, eventually won out, after months and months of arguing while the crusade languished in Antioch. During that time, Hugh was sent off to talk to the Byzantine Empire about rejoining the crusade, but Hugh was never Alexius's favorite, and his pleas seemed to have little impact. So what did Hugh do? Instead of returning to the crusade as originally planned, he basically said, "Well, I'm out. Peace," and wandered off back to Europe, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days. And that's not all. During the months spent sitting around Antioch, a sickness passed through the camp, and Bishop Adhemar took ill and died, leaving the crusade as a whole functionally leaderless. At this point, Raymond, deciding that he possessed the Holy Lance and thus should be leader, started the crusade south again. This decision was in some ways precipitated by one of the grimmest moments in the crusade, the siege of the nearby city of Marat. After massacring the local population, while Bohemond and Raymond disputed who owned the place, the Crusaders were reduced to such a state of hunger that even the Western chroniclers talk in appalled tones about them roasting and boiling the dead Turks to eat. So, with only one major incident of cannibalism behind him, Raymond came to the conclusion that he had been ordained by God to lead the crusade south toward Jerusalem, and started—
I mean, he's been promised a pass into heaven. It doesn't matter how much cannibalism occurs along the way, he gets a free pass into heaven. It doesn't matter what he does from there. If he gets a free pass, unless you can revoke the pass from heaven, like he could kill the Pope and he'd still get into heaven if that is like a no backsies sort of situation.
Trekking through the country, but only Tancred and Robert of Normandy agreed to follow. Jerusalem was in Shia hands at this point in time, so the crusade actually passed through most of the countryside without incident.
That's this whole conflict in a
population
nutshell,
even helped supply them in the hopes that the Crusaders would both leave them alone and give the Shia a good kicking. But then Raymond decided that he needed to attack the town of Arca, which is pretty random as it had no bearing on them getting to Jerusalem. Of course, it would have some bearing if you were secretly planning to subvert the crusade in order to take over Tripoli and set up a kingdom of your own there, but we'll never know if that was Raymond's true intention because he utterly failed. In fact, he failed so spectacularly that Tancred and Robert left him to go join Godfrey, whom Raymond promptly asked for help. The combined Robert, Tancred, Godfrey army showed up, but it still wasn't enough to prosecute the siege, so the crusade just kinda stalled out again. Until a clergyman in Godfrey's army basically challenged the mystic who had found the Holy Lance to a monk duel, and the mystic agreed to undergo an ordeal by fire. Tragically, said mystic was not protected by God during the ordeal, and burned to death, and the lance was discredited. Most of Raymond's credibility had come from possessing that lance, and now, since the lance was no longer a sacred object, thanks to the clergy beatdown, Godfrey took over and said, "Let's get back to going south toward Jerusalem, huh?" So, without further incident, other than one moment where Tancred popped over to conquer Bethlehem just real quick, the Crusaders finally made it to Jerusalem. But by this point, the crusade was in tatters. Baldwin was up in Edessa doing his own thing. Hugh had abandoned the crusade. Bohemond was holding down Antioch. The Byzantines were just done with the whole affair. Stephen had run off, and Adhemar was dead. There weren't really a lot of crusaders left to do the besieging. To add to this, the Fatimid forces holding the city had poisoned all the nearby wells, so the crusaders were also rapidly succumbing to thirst. The remaining princes decided they'd have to take Jerusalem by assault or not at all. There's no way they could maintain a siege. But there was still one other problem. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. There was no lumber to build siege towers or scaling ladders. Things looked pretty hopeless. But just then, a group of Genoese ships arrived at a nearby port and saved the day. The Genoese agreed to dismantle their ships and bring the timber as quickly as possible to Jerusalem. The crusade wasn't over yet. The siege towers began to rise. On July 13th, 1099 CE, the assault on Jerusalem began. The Crusaders split into two forces, one led by Raymond, the other on the opposite side of the city led by Godfrey and Tancred. As Raymond's tower began to roll forward, it was battered and nearly destroyed. Raymond's assault had failed, but Godfrey and Tancred had been far more crafty. Like Raymond, they too had been erecting a siege tower on their side, and seeing this, the defenders had prepared their defenses all along the wall facing it.
I'm sure they were practical,
Raymond,
I just don't
the night
understand
before the
them
assault,
at
Godfrey
all.
and Tancred had disassembled and rebuilt their siege equipment in front of a totally different part of the wall. When the assault began, the section of the wall they attacked was completely unprepared. Still, the fighting swayed back and forth. For 2 days, the Crusaders assaulted the walls, and for 2 days they were held back. Raymond's tower was burnt to the ground, and many of the siege engines were smashed. But at last, Godfrey's tower reached the wall. Godfrey and Tancred were among the first to cross.
Just lets them
The
jump
battle
over
along
wall.
the wall was hard fought. No grand strategy or clever maneuvers, just a desperate melee that resolved down to a few hundred instances of men locked in single combat. But in the end, the Crusaders won out and opened the city gates. Now, with forces pouring in from all sides, the Muslim defenders broke and fled into the city. Victorious, the Crusader army began the biggest massacre the Holy Land had ever seen. Men, women, and children were slain as they ran through the streets. The chroniclers describe Crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood through Jerusalem as they butchered all those they could find. Only the youngest of the crusading princes, Tancred, tried to stop the slaughter, going so far as to give a group of Muslims his banner and telling them to show it to anybody who came for them to let them know that they were under his protection. But even this was futile. Tancred was called off to attend to some other part of the fighting, and when he returned, those he'd offered protection to were dead upon the mosque floor.
Dude.
There would be one more battle outside of Jerusalem, but this was pretty much it. That's how the Crusaders retook the Holy Land. And thus, the First Crusade ended.
Dude, I love a happy ending. That was wonderful. You know, there's like they live happily ever after, and then there's this. They slaughtered everybody indiscriminately. The end. Even those promised safety. Nope, not for you. Not today. Damn. Crusades are stupid, man.